Betrayal doesn't arrive with a scream in a room like this. It arrives with a soft, expensive chime. At 59, I've spent my life discerning the difference between a genuine 5-carat diamond and a well-cut piece of glass. I am rarely fooled. Yet as I sat on the edge of our Italian silk sheets, watching the morning sun illuminate the gold leaf molding of our Park Avenue master suite, I realized I had been living with a forgery for 15 years. Sebastian was in the bathroom, the steam from his high-pressure shower carrying the scent of his Creed Aventus cologne, a scent I had bought him, along with the custom-tailored suits and the title of senior partner at his firm. His iPhone 15 Pro Max sat on the nightstand, vibrating with a persistence that felt vulgar in such a quiet room. I didn't intend to snoop. I was reaching for my Cartier tank watch when the screen lit up, revealing a notification that changed the temperature of the air. Your prescription for prenatal vitamins is ready for pickup. Patient, Chloe Miller. The name Chloe sounded like a cheap cocktail, sugary, thin, and ultimately forgettable. But it was the prenatal part that felt like a surgical strike. Sebastian was 50. He had spent the last decade telling me he was relieved we didn't have the burden of children so we could focus on our legacy and travel to Lake Como every summer. Apparently, he was building a different kind of legacy on the side. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't scream. That would be beneath me. Instead, I stood up, smoothed the front of my silk robe, and began the process of becoming the woman the world feared. I applied my La Mer moisturizer with steady fingers, my reflection in the vanity mirror showing a face that was still striking, refined by time rather than erased by it. Sebastian thought he was married to a trophy from a previous era. He forgot that trophies are made of hardened metal. By the time he stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a plush robe, looking every bit the silver-haired fox he imagined himself to be, I was already dressed in a charcoal Chanel suit. "You're up early, Elena," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He leaned down to kiss my cheek, but I turned my head just enough so he caught the air. "I have an early appraisal at the auction house," I lied, the words tasting like cold ash, "and a few errands to run before the city gets too crowded." I didn't wait for his response. I took the elevator down to the garage where my Mercedes Maybach waited in the shadows. The drive to Columbus Circle was a blur of yellow taxis and shimmering glass. I parked a block away from the boutique pharmacy, the kind of place that sold $30 bars of soap and hand-poured candles to people who didn't look at price tags. I walked inside, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. There, behind the consultation counter, was a girl who couldn't have been more than 25. She was pretty in a fragile, unformed way, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that looked too young for the heavy, expensive rings on her fingers. Her name tag read, Chloe. She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of my Hermes Birkin and the sheer gravity of my presence. She gave me a nervous, professional smile. "Can I help you?" I didn't smile back. I leaned in, the scent of my Dior perfume filling the small space between us, and I spoke with a calmness that made the air in the pharmacy turn to ice. "I'm here for the Miller pickup," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough weight to crush her. "And tell me, Chloe, does Sebastian know you're using my private family insurance policy to pay for those vitamins, or did he tell you he was man enough to handle his own bills?" The girl's face went from pale to ghostly white in a heartbeat. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The line of people behind me went absolutely silent. In that moment, the forgery was exposed, and the real work was just beginning. I didn't wait for the girl to find her voice. I turned on my heel, the sound of my stilettos echoing like a judge's gavel against the marble floor. By the time the automatic doors hissed shut behind me, the cool Manhattan air felt like a benediction. I climbed back into the Mercedes Maybach, the scent of the heated leather seats acting as a familiar sanctuary. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching the rhythmic pulse of the city through the tinted glass. I took out my phone and placed a call to my private bank at J.P. Morgan. "This is Elena Vance," I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. I need a full itemized statement of the secondary black card ending in 4002 for the last 6 months. Send it to my private server, encrypted, and flag any recurring charges for medical suites or luxury rentals in Brooklyn. The young man on the other end didn't ask questions. He knew my name, and more importantly, he knew the size of the trust I managed. I ended the call and pulled into traffic. The anger was there, buried deep, but it was being rapidly replaced by the cold, calculated precision that had made me the most feared appraiser at Sotheby's. Sebastian thought he was playing a game of checkers with a bored socialite. He had no idea I had been playing grandmaster-level chess since before he could afford his first suit. When I walked back into our penthouse, the smell of fresh espresso filled the air. Sebastian was at the kitchen island, looking devastatingly handsome in a cashmere sweater from Brunello Cucinelli that I had gifted him for Christmas. He was scrolling through his iPad Pro, a half-eaten croissant on a Tiffany & Co. porcelain plate beside him. He looked up and gave me that smile, the one that used to make me feel seen, the one that I now realized was just part of his uniform. "You're back sooner than I thought," he said, his eyes scanning my face for any sign of a storm. "How was the auction house?" "Instructive," I replied, setting my Birkin on the counter with a soft thud. I walked over to the Nespresso Virtua machine and began brewing a dark roast. "I saw something today that reminded me of you, Sebastian, a rare sapphire. At first glance, it looked perfect, deep blue, vibrant, flawless. But under the loupe, it was filled with glass lead, a beautiful facade hiding a very cheap interior." Sebastian's hand paused for a fraction of a second over his iPad. "Sounds like a disappointment. I hope you didn't buy it." "Oh, I never buy forgeries," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "I only expose them. By the way, I stopped by the pharmacy on Columbus Circle. I ran into a charming young woman named Chloe. She seemed overwhelmed." The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost comical. He tried to take a sip of his coffee, but his hand betrayed him with a slight tremble. He set the cup down, the porcelain clinking sharply. "Chloe? I don't think I know a Chloe." "Really?" I arched an eyebrow, leaning against the marble island. "That's fascinating, considering you're paying for her prenatal vitamins with my money. You know, Sebastian, if you wanted to start a family, you should have just asked. I would have happily introduced you to a good lawyer. Though, I suspect the one I'm meeting with this afternoon will be much more to my liking than yours." "Elena, listen to me," he started, standing up and reaching for my hand. I stepped back, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, visceral disgust. "Don't," I said, the word a sharp blade. "You've spent 15 years perfecting the art of being the man I wanted you to be. It must be exhausting, living a life that's entirely subsidized by a woman you're betraying. Did you think I was too old to notice? Or just too comfortable to care?" He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the penthouse, the art on the walls, the view of Central Park, the life he had built on the foundation of my name. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the floor was no longer beneath his feet. "I have a lunch at the River Cafe with my attorney, Clara," I said, checking my Cartier watch. "I suggest you use this time to think about where you'll be sleeping tonight. Because by 5 o'clock, the locks on this door will be changed, and your access to the JP Morgan accounts will be a memory. It turns out, Sebastian, that when you break a contract with me, the penalties are significant." I walked toward the door, leaving him standing in the center of the kitchen, a man whose 50 years of life had suddenly shrunk down to the size of a very small, very empty room. The drive to Dumbo was a calculated meditation. I watched the steel cables of the Brooklyn Bridge sweep past like the strings of a giant silent harp. By the time I handed the keys of the Maybach to the valet at the River Cafe, I had shed the skin of a grieving wife and donned the armor of a woman about to conduct a hostile takeover. I stepped out, my Manolo Blahnik heels clicking with lethal intent on the cobblestones. The skyline of Lower Manhattan stood across the water, cold and glittering, much like my current state of mind. Clara was already seated at our usual table, the one with the unobstructed view of the Lady Liberty. She was sipping a glass of Veuve Clicquot and looking over a stack of documents pulled from a Goyard briefcase. At 55, Clara possessed the kind of legal mind that made Wall Street CEOs wake up in a cold sweat. She looked up, her eyes narrowing behind her Tom Ford frames. "You look far too calm for a woman whose husband is currently shopping for baby strollers on her dime," Clara remarked, sliding a glass of champagne toward me. "I've spent 30 years at Sotheby's, Clara. I know how to handle damaged goods," I replied, taking a seat. I didn't touch the drink. I needed my mind sharp. "What did the forensic team find?" Clara sighed, a sound of genuine pity that she rarely afforded anyone. "Sebastian has been busy. It wasn't just the prenatal vitamins, Elena. He's been funneling money through a shell company he called Skyline Renovations. It's a classic move, really. He's been billing your estate for structural repairs on the penthouse that never happened. The money was actually diverted to a high-rise lease in Long Island City. For Chloe." I leaned back, a small dark laugh escaping my throat. Skyline Renovations? He always did have a flair for the dramatic and the unoriginal. "How much?" "In the last 18 months? Nearly 400,000, Clara said, tapping a finger on a spreadsheet. "But here's the kicker. The part where his stupidity actually becomes humorous. He used your personal JP Morgan account to buy her a limited edition Birkin from a reseller last month. The pink one. The one you were on the waitlist for and were told was unavailable." The irony was so sharp it almost felt like a physical sting. My husband hadn't just cheated, he had stolen my place in line for a handbag. It was so petty, so quintessentially Sebastian, that I couldn't help but smile. It was the kind of smile that usually preceded a total liquidation. "He's 50 years old, Clara. He's having a midlife crisis, and he's using my inheritance as his personal playground," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "He thinks because I loved him, I was blind. He thinks that because I provided for him, I was a bank that didn't require a balance sheet." "He also made a mistake with the insurance," Clara added, her voice dropping as well. "To add her to the policy, he had to list her as a domestic dependent. He forged your signature on the affidavit. That's not just grounds for divorce, Elena. That's felony fraud." I looked out at the water, watching a tugboat struggle against the current. Sebastian had spent years trying to convince me he was my equal, my partner, my rock. In reality, he was just a barnacle, clinging to the hull of my life, thinking he was the one steering the ship. "I don't just want a divorce, Clara," I said, turning back to her. "I want him to feel the exact weight of the world he's built on my back. I want the apartment in Long Island City seized. I want the Skyline Renovations accounts frozen. And I want that pink Birkin back. It would look much better on me than on a girl who thinks CVS is a high-end boutique." Clara grinned, a predatory flash of teeth. "And the baby?" "The child is innocent," I said, my heart hardening. "But Sebastian?" "Sebastian is an inclusion in a diamond that needs to be cut out and discarded. Tell the team to move. I want him served before he finishes his afternoon squash game." As I finally took a sip of the champagne, I felt a strange sense of lightness. The betrayal was deep, yes, but the retribution was going to be art. And if there was one thing I knew better than anyone in New York, it was how to price a masterpiece, and exactly how to destroy a fraud. The drive back to Park Avenue felt different. The city hadn't changed. The yellow cabs still jockeyed for position, and the tourists still wandered aimlessly near the base of the Empire State Building. But the air inside the Maybach felt purified. I had the windows cracked just enough to let in the winter chill, a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the lies I had breathed for years. When I entered the penthouse, the silence was no longer heavy. It was waiting. I walked through the gallery, past the Warhol and the Basquiat, and into my master bedroom. Sebastian was still out, likely at his exclusive athletic club on the Upper East Side, sweating away his guilt under the guise of a high-stakes squash match. I could almost see him in his crisp whites, trying to maintain the physique of a man 20 years younger. He kept oblivious to the fact that his world was currently being liquidated. I called the concierge. "Dante, I'm expecting a service team from Gotham Security. Please send them up immediately, and have the building's maintenance supervisor accompany them." 10 minutes later, the digital locks on my front door were being reconfigured. The soft mechanical whirring was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in a decade. I stood in the kitchen. casually peeling a Satsuma orange, the citrus scent cutting through the lingering musk of Sebastian's cologne. On the marble island sat 3 large brown Amazon boxes. I hadn't used his expensive Rimowa luggage. That was far too good for a man of his current standing. Instead, I had spent the last hour tossing his life into cardboard. His bespoke suits from Savile Row, his collection of silk ties, and his vanity-filled grooming kit. All of it was packed with the same clinical efficiency I used to catalog estate sales. I even found the Skyline Renovations folder he had hidden in the back of his closet. I left it on top of the first box, a little parting gift for his journey. Just as the security team finished, the elevator chimed. I checked the hidden Nest camera on my iPad. Sebastian was standing there, his squash racket slung over his shoulder, looking flushed and victorious. He swiped his key fob against the reader. Nothing. He swiped again, faster this time, his brow furrowing. He leaned into the intercom, his voice crackling with a hint of irritation. Dante? My fob isn't working. Must be a magnetic strip issue. I walked to the door and opened it just a crack. Kept secure by the heavy brass safety chain. Sebastian's face lit up with a relieved yet slightly annoyed smile. Elena, thank God, the fob is acting up again. Can you let me in? I'm dying for a shower. I didn't move. I looked at him through the narrow opening, my expression as unreadable as a blank canvas. I'm afraid there's been a structural change, Sebastian. Much like your Skyline Renovations, the access to this unit has been permanently altered. His smile faltered. What are you talking about? Elena, honey, I've had a long day. Open the door. Your boxes are in the service hallway, I said, my voice low and melodic. I've included your squash racket, though I suspect you'll have a hard time finding a club that accepts members with pending felony fraud charges. Dante has been instructed to escort you from the building. If you set foot on this floor again, the security team inside, who are currently holding a very legal restraining order, will act accordingly. Sebastian's face went through a spectacular array of colors, from the pink of his exertion to a sickly pale gray. He grabbed the door handle, rattling it. You can't do this. This is my home. Elena, you're being hysterical. We can talk about this. Hysterical is a word men use for women who have finally stopped believing their nonsense, I replied, leaning closer to the gap. And as for this being your home? Check the deed, darling. You were a long-term guest with a very expensive habit of stealing from the hostess. The party is over. I closed the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was final. Through the heavy wood, I heard him shouting, his voice echoing in the marble hallway, followed by the firm, professional tone of the building's security. I walked back to the living room, sat in my Vitra lounge chair, and picked up a book. I felt a strange, bubbling sensation in my chest, a laugh that had been suppressed for 15 years. It wasn't the laughter of a woman who had lost a husband. It was the laughter of a woman who had finally found her house, was once again her own. The first morning of my new life tasted like fresh peppermint and cold, hard clarity. I woke up at 6 a.m., not because I had to, but because the sun hitting the skyline of Manhattan felt like an invitation I couldn't refuse. I spent an hour in my home gym, the Peloton screen glowing as I pushed myself harder than I had in years. At 59, my muscles were lean, my endurance was high, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of a 50-year-old man's ego on my shoulders. I showered using my favorite Jo Malone citrus oils and dressed in a cream-colored silk jumpsuit from the Row. If I was going to dismantle a man's life today, I was going to look like an architectural masterpiece while doing it. The phone on my vanity buzzed. It was a text from Clara. The forensic accountants found a second hidden lease, Long Island City. A high-rise called The View. Unit 42B. He used your American Express black card for the security deposit, but disguised it as a curatorial expense for the gallery. The girl is there now. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my car keys and my oversized Celine sunglasses. I had a very specific item to retrieve. Driving to Long Island City was a journey into Sebastian's delusion. He had chosen a building with a stunning view of my world, as if he could keep a piece of it, while building his tawdry little kingdom across the river. I parked the Maybach and walked into the lobby. The doorman looked at me, A woman in her late 50s who radiated the kind of quiet authority that usually owned the building, not just lived in it, and didn't even ask for my ID. I simply nodded, said, "Management," and stepped into the elevator. Unit 42B was exactly what I expected. Glass walls, white furniture that looked like it was from an IKEA catalog trying to masquerade as West Elm, and the unmistakable scent of cheap vanilla candles. It was a parody of the life I had given him. Chloe was sitting on the sofa, clutching a Starbucks cup as if it were a life raft. She was wearing one of Sebastian's old cashmere sweaters, the gray one from Loro Piana I had bought him in Paris. It looked ridiculous on her, like a child playing dress-up in a giant's clothes. When she saw me, she didn't scream. She just looked tired. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Actually, dear, I'm the only one who should be here," I replied, walking past her toward the bedroom. "Technically, I'm the one paying the rent. You're just a very expensive, very temporary tenant." I found it sitting on the bed. The limited edition Rose Azalea Birkin 25. It was stunning, a vibrant, unapologetic pink that practically glowed against the cheap polyester duvet. I picked it up, feeling the exquisite grain of the leather. "That was a gift," Chloe said, standing in the doorway, her hands over her small baby bump. "He said he wanted me to have something that matched my soul." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but it was honest. "Your soul must be made of high-grade calfskin and French craftsmanship then." Ironically, Sebastian couldn't even pay for his own soul, let alone yours. He used my personal account for this, which means, under the law, this isn't a gift. It's stolen property. I slid the strap of the Birkin over my arm. It felt right. "And speaking of gifts," I added, looking around the room. "The furniture, the lease, the insurance, it's all being terminated as we speak. You have 48 hours to vacate. I'd suggest calling your parents, or perhaps finding a man who doesn't need his wife's permission to buy a pack of gum." "He loves me," she shouted, a desperate, shrill sound. "He's going to leave you, and we're going to be a family." I walked toward her, stopping just inches away. I looked down at her stomach, then back at her tear-streaked face. "Sebastian doesn't love people, Chloe. He loves lifestyles. He loved my penthouse, my connections, and my bank account. Now that those are gone, you're going to find out very quickly what's left of the man you think you know. Hint, it's not much more than a pile of Savile Row suits and a very large debt to the IRS." As I walked out, I paused at the door. I reached into the Birkin and pulled out a small, elegantly wrapped box I had brought with me. I set it on the counter. "What's that?" she asked, wary. "A parting gift," I said. "It's a book called The 48 Laws of Power. I suggest you read the chapter on never outshine the master. Or in your case, never try to steal from the woman who owns the bank." I stepped out into the hallway, the pink Birkin swinging at my side. I felt a strange sense of pity for her, but mostly I felt the thrill of the hunt. Sebastian was currently at a cheap motel in Jersey. I knew because his Uber history was still linked to my family account. He was about to realize that while he was busy playing house, I was busy repossessing the neighborhood. The night air in Manhattan has a way of turning into a cold blue blade that cuts through even the thickest glass. I was sitting in my library, the only light coming from the amber glow of a single lamp and the flickering pixels of my Kindle Scribe. I was rereading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It felt appropriate. A reminder that we cannot control the actions of others, only our response to them. My response so far had been a masterclass in controlled demolition. The silence was broken by the sharp, persistent buzz of my iPhone. The caller ID displayed a name that used to bring me comfort: Sebastian. I let it ring. Once, twice. On the third cycle, I picked up, but I didn't say a word. I simply waited, swirling a vintage port in a baccarat crystal glass, listening to the static of his desperation. "Elena? Elena, please, don't hang up." His voice was ragged, stripped of the smooth, boardroom confidence he usually wore like a shield. "I'm at a budget inn in Secaucus." "Secaucus, Elena. The sheets smell like industrial bleach and despair. There's a vending machine outside my door that hums louder than a jet engine." I took a slow sip of the port, the liquid velvet coating my tongue. "Secaucus. How poetic," I said, my voice as cool as the marble floors beneath my feet. "It's a transitional space, Sebastian, much like your current status in my life. I hear the continental breakfast is mostly stale muffins and regret. Do try the coffee. I hear it's almost as bitter as your lies. This isn't funny, he snapped, before his voice broke into a pathetic plea. I have nothing. My cards are declined. The Maybach is gone. I had to take an Uber X, Elena. An Uber X with a driver who was eating a tuna sandwich. You can't just erase 15 years in an afternoon. I didn't erase them, darling. I appraised them. And much like that fake sapphire I mentioned, the value came back as 0. I replied. I leaned back in my Vitra chair, watching the lights of a distant plane descending toward JFK. And technically, you erased yourself the moment you signed my name on that insurance affidavit. Tell me, does the motel offer prenatal yoga? I'm sure Chloe would appreciate the amenities. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, a jagged, frantic sound. Chloe, she called me. She said you came there. She said you took the bag. Elena, that bag was the only thing I had to give her. She's pregnant. She's terrified. She should be terrified, I said, my tone sharpening into a razor's edge. She's 26 and she's tethered herself to a 50-year-old man with no assets, no career, and a pending date with a grand jury. As for the Birkin, it's currently sitting on my vanity, right next to my La Mer cream. It looks much happier here. It was never meant for a girl who wears fast fashion polyester and thinks a Starbucks latte is a personality trait. You're a monster, he whispered. No, Sebastian. I'm the bank, and the bank has decided to stop subsidizing your fantasies. You wanted to feel young again? Well, congratulations. You're now exactly like every other 20-something in this city. Broke, homeless, and looking for a miracle. The only difference is they have time. You just have a very expensive taste in suits that you can no longer afford to dry clean. Please, he sobbed. It was a wet, ugly sound. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever Clara wants. Just let me come home. Let me explain. You've spent 15 years explaining, Sebastian. I'm tired of the subtitles, I said. I looked at the baccarat glass, the way the light caught the crystal. The locks have been changed, the accounts are frozen, and I've already sent the screenshots of your Skyline Renovations ledger to the board at your firm. By tomorrow morning, you won't just be homeless, you'll be a pariah. Good night, Sebastian. I'd suggest saving your battery. You're going to need it to find a bus schedule. I tapped the red icon on the screen and placed the phone face down on the mahogany table. The silence returned, but this time it felt like a victory. I picked up my Kindle and returned to the Stoics. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, Marcus Aurelius had written. My thoughts were currently a brilliant, unapologetic shade of pink, exactly like the Birkin he had tried to steal. The silence of the library was usually my sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a witness stand. I sat in the dim light, the glow of the Manhattan skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. In my hand I held a heavy mahogany box. Inside was a Patek Philippe Nautilus I had purchased for Sebastian's 45th birthday at an auction at Christie's. I remembered the way his eyes had lit up, not with love for me, but with the raw, naked lust for the status the watch represented. I set the watch on the desk. It was a beautiful machine, precise and cold, just like him. I found myself thinking of Thomas, my first husband, who had passed away 12 years ago. Thomas didn't care for Patek watches or Park Avenue addresses. He had loved me in the quiet, messy, honest way that required no audience. When I met Sebastian 3 years after Thomas died, I was vulnerable, my judgment clouded by the silence of a house that felt too large. Sebastian hadn't been a partner, he had been a project, a polished stone I thought I could turn into a diamond. I was interrupted by a soft ping from my MacBook Pro. An encrypted email had arrived from an unknown sender. The subject line was blank. I clicked it, expecting more legal jargon from Clara's team, but what I found made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was a series of voice recordings and PDF scans. The sender was Marcus, the quiet, efficient junior associate who had occupied the desk outside Sebastian's office for 5 years. Sebastian had always treated Marcus like a piece of office furniture, assuming the young man was too focused on his spreadsheets to notice the rot. I pressed play on the first recording. Sebastian's voice, sharp and predatory, filled the room. "She's 59 for God's sake," Sebastian was saying, his voice echoing with a cruelty I had never heard in person. "She's getting forgetful. A few misplaced keys here, a forgotten dinner reservation there. If we play it right, the board will see her as a liability. Once the court declares her mentally incompetent, that prenup won't be worth the paper it's printed on. I'll have the gallery, the penthouse, and enough liquidity to retire in Saint-Tropez before she even realizes she's in a managed care facility. The recording ended. I sat there, the air in my lungs feeling like jagged glass. He hadn't just been cheating. He hadn't just been stealing. He had been plotting to erase my very autonomy, to gaslight me into a gilded cage so he could strip my life for parts. The depth of the sociopathy was breathtaking. He had kissed me every morning while calculating the cost of my institutionalization. I took a shaky breath and reached for my phone, calling Marcus. He picked up on the first ring. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't sit on it anymore. He fired me this afternoon because I wouldn't help him backdate those Skyline invoices. He thinks I'm a nobody, but I have every backup of his private server." "Marcus," I said, my voice returning to its iron-cold baseline. "You've just done something very brave, and very lucrative. I'm sending a car for you. Bring everything. We aren't just going to divorce him anymore. We are going to ensure he never sees the inside of a boardroom or a penthouse ever again." I hung up and looked at the Patek Philippe on the desk. Its steady ticking felt like a countdown. Sebastian thought he was the architect of my downfall, but he had forgotten the first rule of restoration. You never underestimate the woman who knows how to spot a crack in the foundation. I picked up the watch and dropped it into a heavy baccarat crystal trash bin. The sound of the glass meeting the metal was the most satisfying thing I had heard all night. The Ritz-Carlton on Central Park South is where New York's old money goes to feel young, and where new money goes to feel legitimate. As I sat in the plush velvet chair of my dressing room, the vanity lights reflecting off a Tiffany & Co. Schlumberger necklace, I didn't feel old or new. I felt eternal. I was 59, and I was about to perform the most delicate surgery of my career. The total amputation of a parasite. I watched through the mirror as my stylist adjusted the hem of my midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown. It was a dress designed for a woman who didn't need to shout to be heard. I looked at the black screen of my phone. A text from Marcus sat there like a loaded weapon. "The files are uploaded to the Gala's media server. We're live whenever you give the signal." I picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Budget Inn in Secaucus. Sebastian answered on the first ring, his voice a frantic, breathless mess. "Elena? Elena, thank God. I've been sitting here staring at a cockroach for 3 hours. Please tell me the car is coming." "The car is already downstairs, Sebastian," I said, my voice a smooth, dangerous silk. "But it's not taking you to the penthouse. It's taking you to a tuxedo rental shop on 5th Avenue. I've pre-selected a Ralph Lauren purple label for you. You are going to meet me at the Ritz-Carlton for the Arts Gala. If you want any hope of a settlement that doesn't involve you living in a shelter, you will be there. You will be charming. You will be the perfect husband for exactly 3 hours." "The gala? Elena, I can do that. I can be better, I swear," he stammered, the sound of his hope almost as pathetic as his sobbing. He still believed his charm was a currency I accepted. He didn't realize the exchange rate had crashed to 0. "Don't be late, Sebastian. And for heaven's sake, use the grooming kit I sent in the car. You smell like cheap motels and desperation even through the phone." I ended the call and stood up, the weight of the diamonds around my neck feeling like a promise. An hour later, I was standing in the foyer of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, a glass of Dom Perignon in my hand. The room was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the hum of conversations that cost millions. I saw him then. Sebastian entered the room, looking every bit the polished financier. The Ralph Lauren tuxedo fit him perfectly, hiding the fact that his bank account was currently a black hole. He spotted me and navigated the crowd with that practiced predatory grace I had once mistaken for confidence. "Elena," he whispered, reaching for my hand. I let him take it, but my skin crawled at the touch. "You look magnificent, like the first day I saw you at the Guggenheim. And you look like a man who is one mistake away from a cardboard box," I replied with a tight, social smile for the benefit of the surrounding photographers. "Smile for the cameras, Sebastian. This is your premiere performance, or perhaps your closing night." We moved through the crowd, playing the part of the Park Avenue power couple. We chatted with hedge fund managers and museum curators. Sebastian was in his element, laughing at the right moments, dropping names of vintage wines and obscure artists. He actually started to look relaxed, as if he believed he had charmed his way back into the fortress. "See? We're good at this, Elena," he murmured as we walked toward the stage where the keynote presentation was about to begin. "We're a team. Let's put this pharmacy nonsense behind us. We can go to the Hamptons this weekend. Just us." I stopped at the edge of the stage, looking up at the massive LED screen that usually displayed the names of the night's biggest donors. I took a slow sip of my champagne, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. "The Hamptons sounds lovely, Sebastian. But I think you'll find the climate in upstate New York, specifically near the correctional facilities, is much more suited to your current trajectory." The lights dimmed. The chatter in the room died down to a respectful hush. The chairman of the board stepped to the microphone, ready to introduce the evening's highlights. Sebastian squeezed my arm, his smile wide and arrogant. He thought this was his moment of redemption. He didn't know I had replaced the highlight reel with a different kind of production. "I have a surprise for you, darling," I whispered into his ear, the scent of his expensive cologne now smelling like the rot of a dying animal. "It's a premiere. I call it the Skyline Renovations, a study in fraud." The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton fell into a practiced, elegant hush as the lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Sebastian stood beside me, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a man who believed he had successfully navigated a shipwreck. He adjusted his Ralph Lauren cufflinks, his fingers brushing against my arm in a way that felt like a spider's crawl. He whispered, "This is it, Elena. Our future starts tonight." I didn't answer. I just watched the massive LED screen at the front of the hall. The chairman took the stage, his voice booming through the high-end Bose sound system. "And now a special tribute to the woman who has made tonight possible and the man who stands by her side." The video started, but there were no photos of us at Lake Como or the Hamptons. Instead, a grainy, high-definition image of a spreadsheet appeared. The header read, "Skyline Renovations, Private Ledger." The room, filled with New York's most eagle-eyed financiers, shifted in their seats. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd, the sound of 1,000 people realizing they were watching a televised execution. Then, the audio kicked in. It was the recording Marcus had sent me. Sebastian's voice, amplified to a haunting volume, echoed through the Ritz's gilded cornices. "Once the court declares her mentally incompetent, that prenup won't be worth the paper it's printed on. I'll have the gallery, the penthouse." Sebastian's hand dropped from my arm as if he'd been burned. He turned to me, his face a grotesque mask of shock and terror. "Elena, what is this?" I didn't look at him. I looked at the screen as it displayed the invoice for the Rose Azalea Birkin, followed by the lease agreement for the View in Long Island City, signed with my forged signature. The evidence was presented with the same clinical precision I used to appraise a masterpiece. It was beautiful. It was devastating. The chairman's face turned a shade of crimson that rivaled the Pinot Noir being served. The room exploded into a cacophony of gasps and sharp whispers. Sebastian tried to step back, to melt into the shadows of the velvet curtains, but the crowd had already parted around him, leaving him on a lonely island of his own making. "Elena, let's go. We have to leave. Now," he hissed, grabbing my shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere, Sebastian," I said, my voice barely a whisper yet somehow louder than his panic. "But you are." Two men in dark, nondescript suits stepped out from behind a marble pillar. They didn't look like gala guests. They looked like the federal government. One of them held up a badge that glinted coldly under the chandelier. "Sebastian Vance? Special Agent Miller, FBI Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for interstate wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut over his Ralph Lauren sleeves was the most melodic sound I had ever heard. It was sharp, rhythmic, and final. Sebastian didn't fight. He couldn't. He looked around the room, at the billionaires, the curators, the people whose respect he had craved more than my love, and saw nothing but disgust. As they led him toward the service exit, he looked back at me one last time. His eyes were wide, pleading, looking for the woman he thought he could break. I hope the orange jumpsuit comes in cashmere, Sebastian, I said, raising my glass of Dom Perignon in a silent toast. But I suspect you'll find the texture a bit lacking. The doors closed behind him. The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of lilies and justice. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for the man I had lost, but for the years I had spent believing in a ghost. It was a quiet, internal sob that never reached my eyes. I took a deep breath, the cold New York air from a nearby open window filling my lungs, and realized that for the first time in 15 years, I could finally breathe. 6 months later, the air in the Hamptons smelled of salt spray, wild roses, and the kind of profound peace that only comes after a long, necessary storm. I was sitting on the teak deck of my new beach house in Montauk, a glass of chilled Whispering Angel rosé in one hand and a Kindle Paperwhite in the other. I had just finished rereading The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, and for the first time in my 59 years, the title felt like a personal manifesto rather than a provocative suggestion. Behind me, the house was a masterpiece of glass and driftwood-colored cedar, a far cry from the gilded, heavy silence of the Park Avenue penthouse. I had sold that place a month after the trial. I didn't want to live among the ghosts of Sebastian's lies or the echoes of his staged laughter. I had liquidated the art he had tried to steal and donated a significant portion of the proceeds to a foundation for women's legal defense. The news from the city was a distant hum, like the sound of the surf. Sebastian had been sentenced to 8 years at Otisville. The Skyline Renovations fraud had turned out to be deeper than even Clara had suspected, involving a network of shell companies that had defrauded more than just my estate. He had traded his Ralph Lauren tuxedos for a drab olive jumpsuit. There was no cashmere there, only the cold, hard reality of a man who had finally run out of other people's money. As for Chloe, she had vanished back to her hometown in Ohio, the Rose Azalea Birkin, which I had ultimately auctioned for charity, nothing more than a bitter memory in her rearview mirror. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It was the delivery I had been expecting from Amazon, a fresh box of paints and canvases. Since the trial, I had returned to my first love, abstract expressionism. I wasn't appraising other people's masterpieces anymore. I was creating my own. A man walked up the dunes from the beach, carrying a surfboard and a pair of Starbucks cups. His name was Julian, a name that, ironically, felt fresh and honest when he said it. He was 62, a retired maritime architect with silver hair, laughing eyes, and a soul that didn't need to be subsidized. We had met a month ago at an art gallery opening in East Hampton, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt a spark that wasn't born of vanity or convenience. "I thought you might need a refill," he said, his voice a warm, genuine rasp as he handed me a hot latte. He leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture so simple and filled with respect that it made my heart feel light. "Thank you, Julian," I said, leaning back into the soft cushions of my outdoor sofa. We sat there in silence for a while, watching the Atlantic turn from a deep sapphire to a soft, bruised purple as the sun began to set. My Mercedes S-Class sat in the driveway, its sleek lines catching the evening light. But it was no longer a fortress I used to hide from my life. It was just a car. My real wealth was the freedom I felt in my own skin. I looked at my hands. The Romanov emerald was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant band of hammered gold I had bought for myself. My skin was tanned, my eyes were clear, and the weight I had been carrying for 59 years had finally dissolved into the salt air. I realized then that Sebastian hadn't just been a husband. He had been a lesson. He had taught me that the most valuable thing I owned wasn't my bank account, my penthouse, or my reputation. It was my time. As the first stars began to blink over the ocean, Julian reached for my hand. I let him take it. We didn't talk about the future or the past. We just existed in the present, a space where silence was no longer a luxury, but a shared, beautiful truth. Life wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. And in the high-stakes world of New York, that was the only masterpiece that truly mattered. The golden hour in Montauk has a way of turning everything it touches into a living painting. I sat on my porch, wrapped in an oversized Loro Piana cashmere throw, watching the sky transition from a fiery orange to a dusty romantic lavender. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of a diptyque beige candle I had lit inside, mingling with the sharp, clean salt spray of the Atlantic. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with flecks of cerulean blue from my Winsor & Newton oil paints. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to wash them away. These stains weren't like the ones Sebastian had left on my life. These were marks of creation, not destruction. The memory of that morning at the pharmacy felt like a scene from a movie I had watched a lifetime ago. It was the day my world broke, yes, but it was also the day the light finally got in. The glass door behind me creaked open. Julian walked out, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. Not the frantic, I need to impress you espresso Sebastian used to make, but a simple, honest brew. He didn't say anything. He just sat on the teak bench beside me, his shoulder brushing mine as we watched the moon rise over the restless water. There were no hidden agendas here, no forged signatures, no secret leases, just 2 people who had survived the storms of their past and finally found a quiet harbor. "You're thinking again," he whispered, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his eyes. "I'm just realizing," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder, "that for 59 years, I thought luxury was a Park Avenue address. I was wrong. Luxury is the ability to breathe without checking the air for lies." I closed my eyes and let the sound of the waves pull me into a deep, quiet contentment. My life wasn't a curated gallery anymore. It was a home. And for the first time, I wasn't just the curator. I was the masterpiece.